This video is brought to you by Ground News. For 3 weeks now, mass protests have been spreading across Georgia, a country of 4 million people in the Caucasus, sandwiched between Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia and Turkey. This comes off the back of months, if not years, of political upheaval, culminating in a rigged parliamentary election in late October, which saw the incumbent pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party consolidate its rule with an apparent 54% of the vote. Then, on Saturday, Georgian Dream announced that former footballer turned politician Mikhail Kavalashvili had been elected as president, winning 224 out of 225 electoral college votes. However, Kavalashvili was the only contender, as Georgia's 4 main opposition groups all decided to boycott parliament to protest the election results. Now, Georgia's outgoing Western-aligned president, Paris-born Salom Zurabichvili, is refusing to leave office, calling the result of the October election a parody and saying, "I'm not going anywhere, I won't leave anyone, I'm here because this country at this moment needs legitimate institutions." So in this video, we'll explain the political chaos currently engulfing Georgia, where it's all come from, and how the mass protests we're seeing at the moment might end. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. But first, let's recap Georgia's recent political turbulence. The main background you need to know is that the Georgian Dream, or GD, has been in power for over a decade, since it won the 2012 election as a coalition of 6 parties, promising a more pragmatic approach to Russia while maintaining a pro-Western foreign policy stance. However, as time's gone on, the party has taken on a steadily more authoritarian and pro-Russia bent. In June 2019, a series of mass protests were triggered after the GD invited a Russian MP, Sergei Gavrilov, to open a parliamentary session on Christian orthodoxy, in which he made statements supporting the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, 2 regions of northern Georgia which have been occupied by Russia since Russia invaded in 2008, and which together make up about 20% of Georgia's territory. This sparked fury both inside the chamber and outside the parliament building, where protests turned violent, with hundreds of people injured or arrested. Wrapped in a Georgian flag, one MP, Elena Kostaria of the Liberal European Georgia Party, said the GD had brought the Russian occupiers in and let them sit in the speaker's chair, calling the invitation a slap in the face of recent Georgian history. The protests continued for months, with the public calling for GD resignations and electoral reform. However, even after several concessions were granted, such as the resignation of Prime Minister Mamuka Baktadze and an increase in the number of seats elected by proportional representation, the results of the 2020 parliamentary election then sparked another lot of violent protests, which lasted for another 6 months, after the opposition parties accused Georgian Dream of vote rigging and election fraud. This ultimately led to the EU getting involved to end the crisis, with European Council President Charles Michel visiting Georgia in March 2021 to mediate talks between then Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili and the opposition. Anyway, now that we've brought you up to speed, let's explain what's happening right now. As we mentioned in the intro, Georgia has now entered its 3rd week of nationwide protests, with reports of police tear gassing and using water cannons on people protesting against 3 things. First, the results of the October parliamentary election. Second, the ensuing decision to suspend EU accession talks until at least 2028. And third, the appointment of footballer turned politician Kavalashvili as president. So, the first thing that sparked the protests was the October 2024 election, which is widely considered to have been rigged in favour of GD. Results published by Georgia's Central Election Commission showed GD winning 53.9% of the vote, the Pro-Western Coalition for Change coming second with 11%, and the Pro-Western United National Movement coming third with 10.2%. While in the capital Tbilisi and other big cities GD lost by a significant margin, accounts of election fraud in rural areas sent the Georgian public into a frenzy. Eyewitnesses reported voters being given ballots already marked for GD, GD voters being offered multiple ballot papers, and even ballot stuffing. President Zurabichvili said the election was fraudulent and claimed that the country had fallen victim to a Russian special operation. What then made things worse, though, was the ensuing decision by the GD government to suspend EU accession talks until at least 2028. For context, Georgia has experienced a series of colour revolutions, i.e. movements to change governments and society in post-Soviet states, since at least 2003, and since then, the share of the population in favour of EU membership has grown. Recent polls suggest around 80% of Georgians now want to join the EU, and in November 2023, Georgia was granted EU candidate status. However, a controversial foreign agents law, which we did a video on last year, which requires any NGO or media organisation receiving more than 20% of its funding from abroad to register with the state as foreign agents, has strained EU-Georgia relations, as it mimics a similar law passed in Russia back in 2012, and is seen by the EU as inconsistent with the bloc's aims. Anyway, this has only intensified the protests, and last week a delegation of 6 MEPs from across Europe travelled to Georgia to join them. The EU urged Georgian Dream to, quote, de-escalate and put an end to this environment that comes with severe costs for the Georgian people. And earlier this month, Ukraine and 3 EU countries, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, even put sanctions on Georgia amid rising violence. Finally, the third reason for the ongoing protests is the election of footballer turned populist Mikhail Kavralashvili, a former Manchester City player, as president, in a vote where he was the only candidate. This was because all of Georgia's opposition parties boycotted it, arguing that the process was rigged from the start. To mock Kavralashvili after his election, protesters ran around the government square in Tbilisi kicking footballs, with some even carrying diplomas to ridicule his lack of a university degree. But humour aside, critics have described Kavralashvili's appointment as the final stage in a process of state capture by the Georgian Dream's founder, pro-Russian oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili. The protests are seemingly escalating day by day. Reports suggest that at least 400 protesters, including opposition leaders and activists, have been arrested so far, with more than 100 treated for injuries, plus at least 50 journalists reportedly injured in clashes. The question many people are now wondering is, how does this all end? We have a couple of ideas, although, as ever, nobody can be sure. The first potential solution could be holding new elections under the old Central Election Commission or under international supervision, as recommended by the EU Parliament in a resolution following the October election. However, given that Georgia's Constitutional Court has rejected all appeals to hold new elections, validating the results on the 3rd of December, holding free and fair elections safely looks difficult. So, unless outgoing President Zurabishvili can find a way to intervene, possibly with the help of a couple of European foreign ministers, before she gets removed and replaced with Kavralashvili on 29th of December, the protests are likely to radicalise even further, go underground, or end by state violence. That's certainly going to be worth paying attention to, and keeping up with the news is made easier by Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organise them by story, and every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality and ownership of all the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organisations. For instance, take this other major European story about the German Chancellor losing his vote of no confidence. Right away, you can see that the story had 575 outlets reporting on it. Of these, 39% lean left, while 34% lean right. You can also swipe through some of the headlines to see just how different some of the reporting can be based on these biases, with the left tending to focus on the historical significance of the event, while the right tends to focus on the economic and political implications, painting a negative view as the country heads towards elections. One of my favourite features of theirs is My News Bias. It's basically a fitness tracker, but for news. It tracks my reading habits over time, my trends in political bias, the specific news outlets I read the most, even the specific topics I gravitate towards. It's been really helpful in minimising my personal blind spots. Now, as an impartial news outlet, we're passionate about informing our viewers about bias and helping them to understand how it affects the media they consume. Ground News is very effective at this, showing you exactly how each side of the political divide covers each story you see online. And best of all, we're currently offering viewers 50% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to all of their amazing features like their blind spot feed. This is their biggest discount of the year. So go to ground.news/TLDR, click the QR code here on screen, or use the link in the description to subscribe today.